Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Blaine Bridges. Tonight, we'll be discussing the nature of evil. To begin this lecture, I want to quote from a science fiction book written by the author R.A. Lafferty. The book is called Passmaster. In the scene I'm going to read from, Satan appears as the protagonist of the story, a role amusingly occupied by the Catholic saint Thomas More. Satan says these words, "I was always, and the belief in me comes and goes. Was I not from the ocean from the beginning? You will, and your kind will turn back into an animal in my presence. You will turn back further. I will annihilate you. I am nothing at all, but all who encounter me make the mistake of misunderstanding my nothingness. It is a vortex. There is no quiet or static aspect to it. Consider me topologically. Do I not envelop all the universes? Consider them as turned inside out. Now everything is on the inside of my nothingness. Many consider the nothing a mere negative, and they consider it so to their death and obliteration. Your own mind and its imagery weakens. It is myself putting out the flame. Every dull thing you do, every cliche you utter, you come closer to me. Every lie you tell, I win. But it is in the tired lies you tell where I win most toweringly. I eat you up. I devour your substance." What a terrifying display of malevolence. Evil presents itself to us as insuperable and awesome, and it has the power to captivate our imagination. But what is evil? How does someone become evil? How does an evil person think? Are the evil as empowered as they present themselves as being? What is the mystery of evil that draws our attention to it? To answer these questions, we must answer a more fundamental question first. The much more fundamental question we have to ask ourselves is this: what is good? We're going to get into a kind of philosophical discussion at this point. Goodness, classically speaking, is being, or rather, goodness is a positive state of existence. The greater the being of a subject, the greater its good. To elaborate on this point, we should consider a series of questions. Is it better to be intelligent or unintelligent? Is it better to be healthy or unhealthy? Is it better to be organized or disorganized? Is it better to be rational or irrational? Is it better to be scrupulous or unscrupulous? Is it better to be eloquent or ineloquent? Is it better to be patient or impatient? The qualities of intelligence, health, organization, rationality, scrupulosity, eloquence, and patience are each a positive state of being. In every instance, a desirable quality is present. The inversion of these states indicates a privation of being, or a distinct lack of something specific. If a person is unintelligent, it may be because his brain is smaller than an intelligent man's brain, or otherwise has been damaged. Perhaps it's due to a privation of knowledge. If a person is unhealthy, it's because of a lack of antibodies or white blood cells. If a person is disorganized, it's because they lack order. If a person is irrational, it's because they have no perspective. If a person is unscrupulous, it's because they are without morals. If a person is ineloquent, it's because they have a small vocabulary. And if a person is impatient, it is because they have no discipline. I want you to keep this concept in mind as we discuss this issue further. The will, that is, our intentions towards something, is directed towards being as its good out of a practical need for survival. Now that we've answered what goodness is, we can answer the real question: what is evil? Evil in this model is a kind of non-being. It exists only parasitically to the good. Consider this: if a commandment given by God is life, that is, if obeying a commandment enhances our being, then disobeying a commandment brings death. Or using this theological vocabulary, it diminishes our being. The possibility to do evil exists because the commandment to do good has been given. Non-being becomes parasitic upon being through the agency imbued upon mankind. The fall has intensified this possibility. The spirit of man seeks after the good, for in it is implanted the desire for God. But the flesh is thoroughly corrupted and confuses our perception of what is good. There is an intrinsic opposition between the two. As Paul says in Romans chapter 7, verses 14 through 24, "We know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good, as it is, it is no longer myself who do it, but it is sin living within me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living within me that does it. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law. But I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man that I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? This struggle between the flesh and the spirit is epitomized in the temptations of Jesus Christ, which I'm going to read to you right now. Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward and hungered. And then the tempter came to him. He said, If thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread. And so what Satan is actually saying to Jesus is this: satisfy your appetites. Indulge your sensual desires. Do whatever you feel like doing. But Jesus answered and said, It is written, men shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Then the devil taketh him up to a holy city, and setteth him on the pinnacle of the temple, and saith unto him, If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down. For it is written, He shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou shalt dash thy foot against a stone. And here Satan again, tempting Jesus, is asking him, why not give people wonders, surprises, novelties? Be everything to everyone. Without principles, you can seduce anybody. And Jesus said unto him, It is written again, Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. And again the devil taketh him up to an exceedingly high mountain, and showeth him all the nations of the world and the glory of them. And this temptation is the one that we're most susceptible to today. And that is this, that theology is actually politics. Why bother with God and the transcendent at all? All that matters is politics. Holding the shining globe of the world in his hand, Satan said, All these kingdoms are mine, and I will give them to you if falling down you will adore me. Then Jesus said unto him, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God only, and him only shalt thou serve. In every instance of temptation, the Lord subordinated the desire of the flesh to the spirit by remembering God, who is the source of all being. So here's a question I want you to ponder. Were the things Jesus was tempted with inherently evil? Is it wrong to satiate our hunger, to experience novelty, to make ourselves attractive to other people? Is it immoral to seek change through politics? The answer is obvious. No. Inherent in each of these desires is a virtue. As I said, evil is parasitic on the good. So let's examine more carefully what this really means by answering this question. How do you become evil? Before I explain how a person becomes evil, a few key points must be made. Human beings are not inherently evil. Rather, we are inherently good. Since we were made by God, we have a natural desire for Him. However, that desire for God has been confused by the fall. In the fall, our natures were wounded, and we became susceptible to the temptations to replace the goods that emanate from God for God Himself. I explained previously that goodness is being, and since God is the source of being, the will ought to be directed towards Him. Nevertheless, because we are not in the presence of God, we do not have direct knowledge of Him, and so we often mistake lesser goods for the highest good. As Thomas Aquinas says, to know that God exists in a general and confused way is implanted in us by nature, inasmuch as God is man's beatitude. For man naturally desires happiness, and what is naturally desired by man must be naturally known to him. This, however, is not to know absolutely that God exists. Just as to know that someone is approaching is not the same as to know that Peter is approaching, even though it is Peter who is approaching. For many, there are those who imagine that man's perfect good is something other than God, happiness, could consist of riches, and in others pleasures, and in others something else. It is in this confusion, that is replacing God as our highest good with goods that emanate from Him, that our nature becomes perverted. I want to examine a quote by an author named G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton says these words, "The modern world is not evil. In some ways, the modern world is far too good. It's full of wild and wasted virtues. When a religious scheme is shattered, as Christianity was shattered at the Reformation, it is not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose, and they wander and do damage, but the virtues are let loose also. And the virtues wander more wildly, and the virtues do more terrible damage. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. Thus, some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity, I'm sorry to say, is often untruthful." So this is a point I want to emphasize. Well, it is true that vices corrupt our character. In order for a vice to entice us, we must first see it as a virtue. As I explained, the will is directed towards being, or rather, goodness, out of entirely practical needs. When the virtues are separated and removed from their proper hierarchy, we can justify indulging a vice if we're simultaneously pursuing a virtue. Imagine that a man loves youth more than he loves people. Because of his love for youth, he chooses to marry a young woman. As time passes and her youth fades, and because he loves youth more than he loves humanity, his love for her fades also. Youth is a delight to our eyes. It is indeed good, an actual treasure that should be valued. But when it's separated from a love of people, our love for people becomes impermanent. Thus, our natural and laudable love of youth can have the power to cause our hearts to be cold and callous to any person who no longer possesses it. I want to examine something that Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics, which is a text that essentially serves as the foundation of ethics in the West. Aristotle says these words, "And further, the life of active virtue is essentially pleasant, for the feeling of pleasure is an experience of the soul, and a thing gives a man pleasure in regards to which he is described as fond, so-and-so. For instance, a horse gives pleasure to one fond of horses, a play to one fond of theater. And similarly, just actions are pleasant to the lover of justice, and acts conforming with virtue generally to the lover of virtue." As Aristotle says, pleasure is an experience of the soul, and pleasure is felt by the soul through action taken to obtain that which we are fond of. Therefore, the body becomes conformed to the operations of the soul in the pleasure felt by it. If, as Aristotle says, the life of active virtue is essentially pleasant, then the act of directing the will towards the virtue will be pleasurable in itself. For many, this act of directing the will towards a virtue is enough to satisfy their conscience, and thus justify any action taken to obtain that virtue. For the pleasure they feel in its pursuit validates their actions. The validation felt by the experience of pleasure in the pursuit of even very meager virtues can lead a man to commit great evil. As the body becomes conformed to these affections of the soul, committing acts of evil becomes a pleasure in itself. I want us to consider the following quote from a book by Dostoevsky called Notes from Underground. The protagonist of the story is an extremely evil person, and he says these words about the evil acts that he commits. "I got to the point of feeling a sort of secret, abnormal, despicable enjoyment in returning home to my corner on some disgusting Petersburg night, acutely conscious that that day I had committed a loathsome action again, that what was done could never be undone, and secretly, inwardly, gnawing at myself for it, tearing and consuming myself, till at last the bitterness turned into a sort of shameful, accursed sweetness. And at that last, into a positive, real enjoyment. Yes, into enjoyment. I insist upon that. I have spoken of this because I keep wanting to know for a fact whether other people feel such enjoyment. I'll explain. The enjoyment was just from the too intense consciousness of one's own degradation. It was from feeling oneself that one had reached the last barrier, that it was horrible, but that it could not be otherwise, that there was no escape for you, that you could never become a different man, that even if time and faith were still left you to change into something different, you would most likely not wish to change. Or if you did wish to, even then you would do nothing, because perhaps, in reality, there is nothing for you to change into. So why don't we take a moment to consider the psychology of evil people? We have to ask ourselves a question. What kind of person becomes evil? Let's contemplate another quote by the author G.K. Chesterton. He says these words, "Thoroughly worldly people never understand even the world. They rely altogether on a few cynical maxims which are not true." Once I remember walking with a prosperous publisher who made a remark which I had often heard before. It is indeed almost a motto of the modern world. Yet I heard it once too often, and I saw suddenly that there was nothing in it. The publisher said of somebody, "That man will get on. He believes in himself." And I remember that as I lifted my head to listen, my eye caught an omnibus on which was written Hanwell. Hanwell was an insane asylum in Britain in the late 19th century. I said to him, "Shall I tell you where the men are who most believe in themselves? For I can tell you. I know of men who believe in themselves more colossally than Napoleon or Caesar. I know where fixed the flame star of certainty and success. I can guide you to the thrones of the supermen. The men who really believe in themselves are all in lunatic asylums." Let's explore this idea that those who have the propensity to become evil elevate themselves above everyone else. I want to quote from the epic poem by Milton, Paradise Lost. The poem says these words, "That we must charge o'er heaven this mournful gloom for that celestial light. Be it so, since he who is now sovereign can dispose and bid. What shall be right? Farthest from him is best. Whom reason hath made equal, force has made supreme, above his equals. Farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors! Hail, infernal world, and thou profoundest hell. Receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I still be the same? And what should I be? All but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater. Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built. Here for his envy will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." I want to focus on the most psychologically revealing line in this excerpt. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. Satan fell because he believed in his own intellect, above and beyond the power of God. It isn't chaos he wished to sow, but order. Rather than use the means appointed by God to sustain creation, he instead rules according to whim. After all, from Satan's point of view, his ambitions are superior to God's design. I want you to imagine for a moment the way Satan must think. He says these things to himself. If I can just divide these people, pit them against one another, I could rule over them. After all, why not? My reign would be more just than theirs could ever be. Or, don't you see, if I but accuse this person of impropriety, everyone will see that their heart isn't as pure as mine. Am I not more just than he? Shouldn't people see him for who he is and I for who I am? Or, I can tell a lie. Yes, a noble lie. Lies can lead people to a greater good. The truth is just too hard for them to bear. If I sacrifice this scruple called honesty, I can lead people to a higher scruple, and they will be saved. Or most ominously, imagine Satan saying these words to himself. I must slaughter these lambs so I can save so many more lambs. If I can rid the world of these undesirables, the world will be more beautiful, more just, and the posterity of the ones who remain will live a better life, where none will molest them or make them afraid. Yes, a great man must and morally ought to be preeminently a characterless creature. A man of character, an active man, is preeminently a limited creature. Evil's strength is derived from the virtues it perverts to achieve its end. The fatal error that Satan made is explained by C.S. Lewis in his book, The Great Divorce. Hell is indeed a state of mind, but heaven is reality. I want to share another quote by Dostoevsky, who wrote this book, Crime and Punishment, that exemplifies this tragic mindset. The character speaking is the protagonist of the book. His name is Raskolnikov. He's a man who's committed a murder. And this is how he rationalizes his impulse to kill. The only difference is that I don't contend that extraordinary people are always bound to commit breaches of morals, as you call it. In fact, I doubt whether such an argument could be published. I simply hinted that an extraordinary man has the right, that is, not an official right, but an inner right to decide in his own conscience to overstep certain obstacles, and only in case it is essential for the practical fulfillment of his idea. Sometimes, perhaps, of the benefit of the whole of humanity. You say that my article isn't definite. I'm ready to make it as clear as I can. Perhaps I'm right in thinking you want to tell me to. Very well. I maintain that if the discoveries of Kepler and Newton could not have been made known except by sacrificing the lives of 1, a dozen, 100, or more men, Newton would have had the right, would indeed have been in duty bound to eliminate the dozen or 100 men for the sake of making his discoveries known to the whole of humanity. But it does not follow from that Newton had a right to murder people right and left, to steal every day in the market. Then I remember, I maintain in my article that all, legislators and leaders of men, such as Lycurgus, Solon, Mahomet, Napoleon, and so on, were all without exception criminals. From the very fact that, making a new law, they transgressed the ancient one, handed down from their ancestors, and held sacred by the people. And they did not stop short at bloodshed either, if that bloodshed, often of innocent persons, fighting bravely in defense of ancient law, were of use to their cause. It's remarkable, in fact, that the majority, indeed, of these benefactors and leaders of humanity were guilty of terrible carnage. In short, I maintain that all great men, or even men a little out of the common, that is to say, capable of giving some new world, must, from their very nature, be criminals. More or less, of course. Otherwise, it's hard for them to get out of the common rut, and to remain in the common rut is what they can't submit to, from their very nature again. And to my mind, they ought not, indeed, to submit to it. You see that there is nothing particularly new in all that. The same thing has been printed and read 1,000 times before. As for my division of people into ordinary and extraordinary, I acknowledge that it's somewhat arbitrary, but I don't insist upon exact numbers. I only believe in my leading idea that men are in general divided by a law of nature into two categories: inferior, ordinary, that is, so to say, material that serves only to reproduce its kind, and men who have the gift or talent to utter a new word. There are, of course, innumerable subdivisions, but the distinguishing features of both categories are fairly well marked. The first category, generally speaking, are men conservative in temperament and law-abiding. They live under control and love to be controlled. To my thinking, it is their duty to be controlled, because that's their vocation, and there's nothing humiliating in it for them. The second category, all transgress the law. They are the destroyers, or disposed to destruction according to their capacities. The crimes of these men are, of course, relative and varied. For the most part, they seek in very varied ways the destruction of the present for the sake of the better. But if such a one is forced for the sake of his idea to step over a corpse or wade through blood, he can, I maintain, find within himself, in his conscience, a sanction for wading through blood. That depends on the idea and its dimensions. Note that. It's only in that sense I speak of their right to crime in my article. You remember I began it with the legal question. There's no need for such anxiety, however. The masses will scarcely ever admit this right. They punish them or hang them, more or less, and in so doing, fulfill quite justly their conservative vocation. But the same masses set these criminals on a pedestal in the next generation and worship them, more or less. The first category is always the man of the present, the second, the man of the future. The first, preserve the world and people it. The second, move the world and lead it to its goal. Each class has an equal right to exist. In fact, all have equal rights. Well, till the New Jerusalem, of course. I'm going to take a moment to compare this quote with an excerpt from a real-life mass murderer's manifesto. Elliot Rodger was a killer who targeted women because he claims they mistreated him his whole life. I want to demonstrate the mentality of Elliot Rodger and Raskolnikov are identical. He says these words, "Humanity, all of my suffering on this world has been at the hands of humanity, particularly women. It has made me realize just how brutal and twisted humanity is as a species. All I ever wanted was to fit in and live a happy life amongst humanity. But I was cast out and rejected, forced to endure an existence of loneliness and insignificance, all because the females of the human species were incapable of seeing value in me. This is the story of how I, Elliot Rodger, came to be. This is the story of my entire life. It is a dark story of sadness, anger, and hatred. It's a story of war against cruel injustice. In this magnificent story, I will disclose every single detail about my life, every single significant experience that I've pulled from my superior memory, as well as how those experiences have shaped my views of the world. This tragedy did not have to happen. I didn't want things to turn out this way, but humanity forced my hand, and this story will explain why. My life didn't start out dark and twisted. It started out as happy and blissful, living my life to the fullest in a world I thought was good and pure. Why do things have to be this way? I'm sure that is the question everyone will be asking after the day of retribution is over. They'll be asking why, indeed why. That is the question I've had for everyone throughout all my years of suffering. Why was I condemned to live a life of misery and worthlessness while other men were able to experience the pleasures of sex and love with women? Why do things have to be this way? I ask all of you. All I ever wanted was to love women and in turn to be loved by them back. Their behavior towards me has only earned my hatred, and rightfully so. I am the true victim in all of this. I am the good guy. Humanity struck at me first by condemning me to experience so much suffering. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want it. I didn't start this way. I wasn't the one who struck first, but I will finish it by striking back. I will punish everyone, and it will be beautiful. Finally, at long last, I can show the world my true worth." I'm sure that comparing these two passages side by side has revealed many startling similarities. There are delusions of grandeur, righteous indignation, the belief that violence can create a better world. But there's something deeper I want to point out. Evil people believe everyone thinks like them. They genuinely think that if you understood their point of view, you would agree with everything they've done. They want to hear you say these words: "There's nothing evil in your heart. Your vision of the world really is more beautiful than mine." Another quote by Dostoevsky illuminates this reality. He says these words, "As a general rule, people, even wicked people, are much more naive and simple-hearted than we supposed. And we ourselves are too. One thing should be clear at this point. Evil is pathetic." This point is highlighted by Isaiah in the 14th chapter of his book. He says these words about the king of Assyria who's attempting to conquer the world. "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nation? For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation, the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look down upon thee and consider thee, saying, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake the kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of the prisoners?" I love that line, that the people who see the king of Assyria, this conquering force of destruction, shall look down narrowly upon thee and say, "You did this? You're the one who caused all this chaos? But you're nobody." And that is entirely the point. Evil people are remembered because of the havoc they wreak, and not because of anything they are. Evil people are in a state of virtual non-existence, and everything that they envelop dissolves into chaos. Thank you, and good night.